So let's create another class. I'm going to do it underneath here, and it's gonna be a Swift file again, and I'm going to call this Firebase listener. Okay, and again we need to import Firebase. Okay, and let's create the class, call this Firebase listener. And this class doesn't conform to any superclass. So this Firebase listener, we are going to ask to do the Firebase database saving actions, like to check, to fetch something from Firebase, to save something to Firebase. What else? I guess that's it. So we are getting or also to update some things on Firebase. So we are basically communicating with Firebase database. So let's create a static let shared, and we're going to say Firebase listener, and then we're going to create a private init, and we are not going to do anything here. So what we are doing is actually calling a singleton class. So it means that we cannot initialize more than one instance of the class. Every time we want to access it, we just call the shared, which is returning an instantiated Firebase listener object that we already have. That's why we have this private init, which just initializes this. Okay, and now we can write our functions. And in our case, we want to check if the specific user with the specific ID exists in Firebase. So since this class is going to do many things, I want to put like a mark here. And let's say F user, so we can separate the parts that are going to be accessed, so it's easier to read the code. So we have this F user, and the user we are going to use like to save user or to fetch user or to update user, etc. So let's write the function called download current user from Firebase, and then we need to pass the user ID, which is a string, and also I'm going to pass the email of the user, which is a string as well. And this function doesn't return anything because we don't want to return something. What we want to do is to check if the user exists, and if he does exist, we want to download it and save the instance locally with the full user information. So now we are going to use this F collection reference that we have created. So let's access it. So we say Firebase reference, and then we want to access user dictionary, user collection. Then we want to get a document. So if I go back to the Firebase again, once we save, you will see how it works. So you will have a user object here, and underneath you will have different documents, which is the user instances. So we want to fetch a specific document. So imagine like you had a folder, let's say users, and then you are looking if the other documents inside the folder with specific name exists. So we say document, and then we want to pass the path to that document, which is in our case the user ID. And if it does exist, we want to get that document. So it says get document, and then we have this completion block. We just hit enter on it, and it provides us with document snapshot, which is taking a snapshot of that document from Firebase, which is an optional, and then the error is an optional. So let's call this snapshot and error. All right, let's get rid of these empty spaces. So the first thing, as usual, we want to check if there are any errors or if we actually received this snapshot thing, because remember, it's an optional. It may not exist, which in our case, once we access it the first time, it's not gonna exist. So we say guard let snapshot equals, this is just a variable I'm giving a name, and we want to check if it equals to this one. I mean, you don't have to call it snapshot and snapshot, but I just want to keep the name same, but you can call whatever you want. Most important thing is the right side should be snapshot, whatever you called here. So we check if this is available, and if not, we are going to say else, and I want to return, because I don't want to do anything else if the snapshot is not available. So we just stop and exit the function. And then if everything goes according to plan and we do have a snapshot, I want to check if it exists. If snapshot.exists, so this basically checks if a snapshot is not nil or no. And then this snapshot.exists is a part of Firebase dictionary, the true if the document exists. So this returns true or false if any document exists in our Firebase database. So we access this, and then I'm going to have also else statement. And let's put a note for now. We say first login. So if the user doesn't exist yet, because we haven't created yet. So this is our first login, and we need to create a user and save it to Firebase. If it exists, it means the user has already logged in before, and his user object exists on Firebase database. So in case if it exists, what we want to do is we want to create a fuser object, which is our local user object, using the information available on our database. So if I open my user file, here we have this initializer that we can initialize a user object and then just pass the information to it. So we could do like let user equals fuser, and then we had to pass the object ID, email, city, ismail, etc. But you can see here we can pass only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things you can pass, but our fuser object contains many more things. So this initializer is really used only when we are creating the first user locally. But once we download the user from Firebase and save it locally, we want to have access to all these parameters of the user object, because this is how we are going to use our user object. The local user has to have everything. So what we could do is to write another initializer for fuser class, which would take this snapshot from Firebase, which is actually a dictionary, it's a key value pairs, and then return an fuser object for us. So it's like another initializer, which instead of taking all these different parameters, let's go back, all these variables here, instead it would take a dictionary and just create the fuser object. So let's create this init function underneath our main init, and in this function we have to provide a dictionary. So I'm going to say init, and then we have this dictionary, and this is a type of NS dictionary. And again, the reason I'm using NS dictionary is easier for us to get this snapshot and convert to NS dictionary instead of just a dictionary. And now, since this is an initializer, we need to initialize all these objects which are required. So I'm going to copy them, paste them here, and the right hand side of equals I'm going to delete, because we're going to use our dictionary in order to get that. Alright, so if I make just Command P, now it's going to throw many errors. So now that we have access to our dictionary, what we need to do is to do like key value pairs. So we want to say object ID is equals to dictionary, and then we pass the key that we are going to save this object ID under this specific key. And the keys we are going to hold in our constants file. See, we have all these keys here. So when we are going to save a user to Firebase, which we haven't done yet, but when we do, we are going to use the same keys as we have here. So it's easier to us for saving and getting them back. So our key for object ID is going to be K object ID. And since this is dictionary, it may not have a key object ID. So by accessing an object ID, and in case if it doesn't exist in the dictionary, and if we try to force it, like our error here says that casting a value of type any optional, because the Swift compiler here doesn't know what object ID is, but our this dictionary key object ID doesn't know what this is. But it knows that the object ID of our F user is a string. So it says the any optional, we cannot assign type of any optional to a string. In order to fix it, if you ask it to fix it, it will force unwrap it to a string. But in case if you create a user object and for some reason it has no object ID in the dictionary of our Firebase database, this code will crash your application. So the solution here is to create an optional here. So we say the object ID, it may be a string, but in case if it's not a string, we say the question mark. So it says if it's not a string, then assign it to empty string. So this doesn't crash the application. So let's say our compiler comes, access the dictionary, gets the object ID, and maybe there is an integer saved. And if we force unwrap it to string, it will crash it. And we say try to unwrap it to string, it will try, and if it fails, then it's going to assign a default value of empty string to our object ID. So this is a safe way of unwrapping a dictionary in order to not get our application crashed. And the email address is dictionary k email, again as string or empty value, and the rest I'm going to just quickly copy paste and type them. All right, pay attention, the ones that are different than string, we have to specify that this is as double or default value. And then also we have a liked array, which and image links. These two are optional by default. So we are going to write them in different way. We are not going to provide an default values, because if it's a nil, we just say, okay, it's nil, we don't mind. So that's why we say it's equals to, may equal to array of strings. Now, when it comes for the date, there is one difference here we need to keep in mind, because when you save a date in the Firebase, it doesn't save it as a date, but it saves it as a timestamp, which is a specific Firebase way of saving a date. I think it just calculates some seconds from specific date. We are going to look into it once we save our first object. But since this dictionary, init with dictionary will be called in two ways. The first one is when we download the user from Firebase, and the second one is when we get our user from user defaults, which we save as a dictionary, as you remember from our previous classes. So when we save it in user defaults, the date is going to be a date. But when we save it and get it from Firebase, the date is going to be a timestamp. So here, before we assign a date, we want to make sure if it's a timestamp or no, because if it's timestamp, we need to convert the timestamp into a date. And if it's a date which we get from our user defaults, we don't need to do any conversion there. So I'm going to say if let date equals, and then I get this dictionary K date of birth, and then we say this is as timestamp, and you can command click, jump to definition, and it will take you to the Firebase documentation where you can see what the timestamp is and the format of it. So if it's a timestamp, we know that this is from Firebase, so we need to convert it. So I'm going to cut this and paste it here. So date of birth in our case is going to be equals to, and we access this date dot, and we just say date value, which is again Firebase function, and it takes the date from creates a date object from a timestamp. If however this is not the case, so we have the else. In this case, the date is a date object, so we don't have to convert it. So we say that our date is equals to, and we access our key here and say as date. Remember, date, not data. And otherwise we give an optional value of just current date. So we basically say if this is equals to some kind of date object, if it fails to, just initialize a current date and set the date of birth to be a current date. This is the best way to keep everything safe. If the user's date of birth is corrupt or for some reason it's missing, we just create a current date and show it to the user.